to you. Go, Alicia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Addressing Bias in Marketing webinar. We have an incredible guest speaker today. Chloe Wengu is known as a brand scientist and is the director of NobiWorks, a brand visibility consultancy for under-recognized social impact brands. Chloe leverages behavioral science and her proprietary visibility engineering method to make these brands impossible to ignore. NobiWorks equips under-recognized brands with visibility strategies and systems scientifically formulated to help them neutralize visibility biases while commanding and keeping attention in an increasingly crowded marketplace. She's advised everyone from a small Black family-owned mom and pop shop to the first refugee delegation to the UN. Chloe's clients have gone on to be better seen, heard, respected, and resourced. That's look like celebrity endorsements, seats at previously inaccessible tables, and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Chloe lives in the US where she wrestles with an addiction to D&D and tends to her giant Baby Yoda plushie. I'm guessing that one's featured today.
Correct.
That's hilarious.
Hi.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm just going to, Chloe, before you start sharing your screen, I'm just going to quickly talk to everybody about the B Corp Marketers Network.
Yeah.
If you're okay, my name is Tim Frick. I am a co-chair. I'm one of 6, I believe, co-chairs of the US Canada B Corp Marketers Network. We are sponsoring today's webinar, and this is probably about the 30th, 24th. I don't know. It's a couple dozen webinars we've done on all kinds of different topics. We are a professional network within the B Corp community. Our purpose is to build community, to create collaboration, to forge partnerships between US and Canada-based B Corp marketers. We also want to amplify and educate consumers and businesses about the unique value of B Corp certification. We also share best practices, tools, expertise that allows purpose-driven marketers to succeed and prove the ROI of their work. And finally, we emphasize and adhere to ethical marketing best practices, which is the collective impact that we hope to create as a network. And today's Lunch and Learn is exactly along the lines of that. So if you'd like to learn more about us, there's our group is on the Beehive. If you're a B Corp, you can join the Beehive. Otherwise, we do promote, all of the chairs promote their our content on LinkedIn. So feel free to follow me or Alicia or any of the other B Corp marketers on LinkedIn, and you'll hear about our events if you're not in the B Corp community. So with that being said, let's go back to Chloe, and please do tell us about how to address bias in marketing.
My pleasure. Delighted to. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's not something I take for granted. I'm really honored to be with you all. So having that said, I'm going to share my screen. I do have slides, and that's largely because a number of the things that I talk about can be pretty abstract. So I find that it helps to have visual mediums as well as a support. So don't mind me while I get that happening. I will ask for some help from you all. If you could give me a thumbs up or a shout out to let me know that you can see my screen, and that would be amazing. Wonderful. Great. Thank you, friends. So hello, as Tim and Alicia said, I'm here to talk with you about addressing bias in marketing. Obviously, that's a humongous topic. And so I decided to narrow our scope a lot and pick on one tiny particular thing that feels like a standard in the work that we do in marketing and branding and all of the adjacent and tangentially related fields. So technically we're talking about addressing bias, but really I'm gonna, hopefully by the time we're done today, convince you to ditch the ideal client avatar. So we'll see if I'm successful. First things first, though, Whenever I do a workshop or a webinar or something like this, I always like to have an agenda because consent is one of my core values. And I like folks to know where we are at all times, so you can consent to moving forward when you're ready to do so, or you can ask us to hold off if you need more time to process. So right now we're obviously in the welcome sequence, as it were. Next up, we'll be talking about some definitions, so we have some shared language about what we'll be talking about today. Then we'll get into the ideal client avatar, the star of the show. We'll talk a little bit about where bias comes in, and then evidently there is more bias than the bias I talk about at the start. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk about a possible alternative to the ideal client avatar. Then, if time allows, we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to do my best to go real fast so we can get to questions, because I assume that there will be plenty. So with all of that being said, do I have folks' consent to move forward? You just give me thumbs up, hearts. Awesome. Okay, wonderful. So let's get right into it. So what is marketing? And specifically, what is marketing from a scientific perspective? I always like to do things from a scientific perspective because I'm the brand scientist, right? It's on brand, and also it's how I approach just about everything. So what is marketing from a scientific perspective? Well, to talk about that, we need to start with a couple of other definitions. So first, brands, okay? From a scientific perspective, a brand is simply a system of ideas that influences the behavior of other people. Said another way, a brand is a kind of influential real estate in someone's head. So that is a brand. And I know that that is a weird new definition of brand for a lot of folks. But when we're thinking about human minds and brains and the ways in which they work from a mechanical standpoint, that's all that a brand is. Now, if we think about that, that means that as far as a successful brand is concerned, in order for it to succeed, in order for it to work, it needs to be influencing behavior. Okay, that's sort of like the minimum viable parameter. And that brings us to the next question that we have here to ask. What is branding, right? Now, there is the act of branding. I'm cheating a little bit here when I say, okay, a brand's branding, as in noun, a brand's branding are simply its memorable assets, okay? And the reason for this is, if we go back to the definition of what a brand is, right? Remember that it is something that influences the behavior of other people, right? Well, in order to influence behavior, minimum viable, you have to have been remembered at some point in time. That is the minimum viable. If you have not been stored in someone's memory, then you are not going to be able to influence their behavior. So what a brand's branding does is it serves as a memory anchor, right? It is an asset that is meant to be remembered, and it serves as something that can anchor various memories to this system of ideas. Okay, so that's what a brand's branding is, or that's what branding is. Now we come to the question that I asked at the top of all of this, and it's, what is marketing? Well, given all these definitions, marketing is simply leveraging these memorable assets to tell people about the brand, the system of ideas, right? And any of the entities that that brand is attached to, right? So that's part one. Part two is communicating and talking about what these things do, right? The brand and the entities that are attached to that brand. And then finally, refreshing people's memories of that. So there's sort of like three parts to what marketing is. Now, what that means, if I sort of take all of the newfangled things that I've just shared together, what all of that means in total is that a brand is successful when it influences behavior, right? So that brand's influence, which is as you see here defined, its ability to motivate others to pursue and invest in your clients or yourself if you are marketing for your own brand. A brand's influence is reinforced by branding, right? So by ads, by creative, by all of the things that make up branding, right? And marketing facilitates the spread of that influence. So I'm going to pause here. I usually don't pause in the middle of stuff, but I feel like I just threw a lot of new things at people. So I want to see, are there any questions that feels like I'm not going to be able to focus on anything that's said next unless I get this question answered? Or any clarifying things, questions?
Please put your questions, if you have them, in the chat or in the Q&A function, and drop them in there. And if we don't have any, we'll let Chloe move on.
Okay.
Go ahead, Chloe. Thanks.
All right. Okay, great. So it seems like folks are either picking up what I'm putting down so far, or we are so overwhelmed that we're just going to leave things. In either case, we shall move on. So that's what marketing is from a scientific perspective. Okay. Here's where ideal client avatars come in, right? In this whole process that we've been talking about, right? Making sure that we have a system of ideas that can influence the behavior of other people, that we are spreading the influence of that system of ideas, and we are doing so using memory aids and memory anchors, right? In that whole sort of system of things that we are doing as marketers and folks who are in adjacent fields, ICAs are the thing that allow us to answer the question, whose memories do we need access to in order to succeed? Okay. Another way to put this is, who are we targeting? Who's our audience? Who are we trying to connect with, right? That's what ICAs, or ideal client avatars, personas, whatever you want to call them, right? That is what they are intended to do. They allow us to shape our creative. They allow us to refine and position our ads, and they allow us to direct our marketing, right? A, B, C, D, right? And here is generally what an ideal client avatar looks like a pretty typical one, right? You have, on the one hand, demographic information. And so that's census level data, like someone's age or their gender, their socioeconomic status, or their race, right? So you have that information. And then you tend to have psychographics, right? So, and this is where you'll see I have here, insert some details about the kind of person that they are, right? Like, they research everything. They hate small talk. They're super organized, right? Or they prefer Hulu to Netflix, right? Psychographics are, for the uninitiated, essentially just hobbies, affiliations, preferences, right? These tend to be the kind of information that we have in our ideal client avatars. And this is the information that we use to do our jobs as marketers. Now, what that means is that we are saying that demographic and psychographic information, right, is the information that we need in order to change behavior, right? Because remember, in order for a brand to be successful, in order for all of this stuff that we are doing to be successful, the goal is behavior change, right? No matter who you are or what it is that you do, you're in the business of behavior change. Whether or not that's getting folks to go from not buying from you to buying from you, whether or not it is the transformational work that your clients do outside of business, whether or not it is, volunteering to not volunteering, not voting to voting, whatever it happens to be, all of those things are behavior change. And a brand is only as successful as the behavior changes that it intends and it influences, right? So that's what we're saying, that we're saying demographic and psychographic information, that's the information that we need in order to create creative and all of the things that we talked about before that will lead to behavior change. That's what we're saying when we use ideal client avatars. Now, here's the thing about that. When you actually look at what behavioral science has to say about designing behavior change, the things that it tells us are important that you look at, that you focus on, are the motivations that folks have and leveraging those motivations, context and environment and the ways in which those things shift, removing or adding barriers or friction within an environment, incentives that might get people to move or not move, motivational drivers in the environment that generate motivations, right? These are the kinds of things that behavioral science tells us you want to focus on in order to change behavior. Suspiciously absent are demographics and psychographics. Okay. And the reason for that, and the reason that demographics and psychographic information is problematic in as much as making behavior change happen is a couple of things, right? One, that information doesn't really tell us what will motivate change in somebody, right? Someone's age or their race or their gender, the fact that they respect Oprah, that they like Hulu over Netflix, or that they prefer grapefruit seltzer, that information's not going to tell us what will motivate them to change their behavior. We can make assumptions based off of that information, but it's in that making assumptions that bias comes in and things become increasingly problematic. So, essentially, by using ideal client avatars, we are saying this 35-year-old Black woman is probably motivated by ... And we can see why that would be an incredibly problematic foundation for any decision-making process, let alone one that is intimately tied to the bottom line of whatever organization or business you happen to be working with, right? So that's the first issue. Just from an efficacy standpoint, it doesn't give us the information that we need and also is incredibly problematic for those reasons. And then the second issue, or the second place that bias comes in, is you can only profile who you're aware of. And if you are a human being and you are listening to the sound of my voice right now, and I'm going to assume that is you, if you're a human being, then who you're aware of has issues too. And this is where the concept of visibility biases come in, the concept you might have heard in my bio. So what are visibility biases? Well, they poison everything. They are, I'm not going to say they're the worst, but they are the worst. So visibility biases are a subset of cognitive bias. For those who are unfamiliar with what cognitive biases are, they're learned brain chemistry. They're invisible scripts in our heads. And this particular category of cognitive bias allocates our attention in discriminatory ways. A great example of this, and I have 3 examples here, but the example that I'm going to pull from to demonstrate this or to illustrate this more clearly for you all is the racial attention deficit. This is not one that I discovered or that I'm responsible for. It comes out of some research from 2021. And these researchers were able to empirically demonstrate that white Americans are 33% more likely to overlook their Black peers for their white peers. And that's even when they've been incentivized to pay attention to those peers. So when they've been incentivized to pay attention to those peers, the gap is 33%. So what visibility biases mean is that essentially for a certain kind of person, I tend to call these folks under-recognized, right? For a certain kind of person, there is almost always some kind of invisibility cloak that has been thrown over them, right? We've been, as a society, conditioned to overlook and underappreciate them, their ideas, their contributions, so on and so forth, right? we use these biases in everything that we do, including the work that we do as marketers, including the creative that we shape, including the branding and the ads and all of the things that we develop, including the marketing that we construct. And ideal client avatars reinforce that. Because as I said at the top, you can only profile who you're aware of. So if there's a group of folks that you've been conditioned to overlook in the first place, what are the chances that those folks are going to get into your collection of profiles? So then the answer must be, right? Like, we get more folks in the room, right? Like, let's get under-recognized folks in the rooms where we are having these decisions, right? Like, bring them onto our teams, what have you, right? Putting aside the fact that that might be something that is fiscally difficult for a small micro-sized business to do, right? Bringing on more staff or more contractors, right? Even if we put that to the side, right, from a realistic standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, we have this issue to contend with, or these issues to contend with. I call these the invisibility tax, right? So even if we do get some of the right folks, some under-recognized folks in these rooms, here's what happens, right? Those folks end up paying extra as far as time, attention, resources in general are concerned in order to be visible in those rooms, in order to be heard in those rooms. And to, especially if they're trying to be as heard or as visible as their peers, right? This is also part of why folks who are under-recognized, you don't often see them in positions of authority, or they struggle to be seen as part of the club, right? Great example of this, like I said, there are a number of them here. I will just point to one that is also not one that I discovered, right? The ambition penalty. Almost every under-recognized person that I know hears the ambition penalty and they go, ah, I know what that is. The ambition penalty is when you are an under-recognized person, if you display the usual traits of ambition or the traditional traits of ambition, rather than being elevated or praised or lauded for doing so, you are penalized instead, right? So think of all the nasty names that certain kinds of women get called, for example, right? And Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez, who is the researcher who coined this term, describes this as something that's often mislabeled as the confidence gap in women and girls. And so what that means is, rather than these under-recognized folks having a confidence gap, what's actually happening is that they are correctly assessing their environment, seeing like, if I display these traits, I will be penalized. And instead of being penalized, are choosing instead to be seen as lacking confidence, or choosing instead to act in ways that are perceived as lacking confidence. So that's the invisibility tax, right? That's what happens when we invite under-recognized folks into these rooms without, setting up the appropriate structures of support XYZ, right? Translation of all the things that we've said so far, right? A brand's influence, which as we defined before, is its ability to motivate others to pursue and invest in your clients, right? That influence, which is responsible for the success of literally any brand, that is filtered through a wall of visibility biases. And the invisibility tax is the force that keeps that wall in place. So what that means is, if your client is under-recognized, or your client stakeholders happen to be under-recognized folks, then that means that the usual tools that we use in our work, including ideal client avatars, but so many of our usual practices, those things won't cut it. They won't work as well for those folks because they don't take visibility biases, under-recognition, and the invisibility tax into consideration. And so in using those tools and these approaches, we are leaving all of these folks behind. So What's the plan? Replace the ideal client avatar, of course. And obviously, the plan is much, much bigger than this, right? But again, that would be a 5-hour webinar as opposed to the 1 hour that we have currently. And so, as I said, I'm narrowing the scope to this one little tool that seems innocuous enough as it is, right? But before that, aha, I got you. If what I've shared with you so far has been useful or interesting, if you feel like you've learned something new from what I've shared today so far, feedback helps me so much. It allows me to know how I'm doing. It also makes it possible for me to have more opportunities to do things like this. And so what I have here on the screen for you is just a QR code that you can scan with your phone. And in like under 2 minutes, you can give me some feedback about how this has gone so far. Essentially, you'll just be clicking a series of smiley faces. And I'm not above bribery. Uh, so if you do give me this feedback, which I really, really do appreciate, then you will immediately get the link to a piece that I wrote about ideal client avatars in general, right? And so I've only talked a little bit about some of the issues with ideal client avatars, but that piece that I wrote expands upon that. It talks about some of the principles that we might want to look for in alternatives. So just in case the alternative that I share with you today, which is the one that I use with my own clients, if that alternative doesn't like work for you, then at the very least in that piece, you can see the principles that were used to develop that, and you can develop something on your own. And it talks a little bit more about the different pieces of the alternative that I have developed myself with my own clients. So that's something that you'd like to read, and that sounds interesting to you. Please go ahead and click those smiley faces or frowny faces, right? Maybe this sucked for you, I don't know. And then you will get that link right away. So if it's cool with the host, I'd love to give folks maybe a couple of minutes to do that. How are we doing on time also?
Great on time. It's what, 11:40 Chicago time, or yeah, we're good. 11:30 actually. So
Whew.
you're great. I'm sure there's going to be
Amazing.
lots of questions on how to replace the ideal client avatar and what are some of the things that can be done. And I know I certainly have a few. So I look forward to seeing all the questions as they come through in the Q&A or in the chat. So please do add those, folks. After, of course, you're done filling Chloe's quick survey out.
Please. Like I said, I'm bribing you.
Just finished mine.
Thank you. And yeah, actually, that might be helpful as folks are finishing up. If you're planning to do this right now, just drop like done in the chat, or maybe like give us a thumbs up or a heart or something, just so we get the sense for how far along folks are. Ooh, Andre, that's a really good point.
All right, we've had several thumbs up and a couple done. So
Okay.
keep it going, and then we make sure we've got time for questions at the end too, and a couple
Yeah.
people at the end. So definitely hang on to that link for that.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So the alternatives. Okay, so my alternative comes in 2 parts. Okay. The first part is what I call a stakeholder spectrum. And the way that I do this with clients is, first of all, there are at least 3 spectrums, right? And the spectrums that are relevant, it's going to depend, right, on the client that you're working with and what have you. But essentially what we're trying to do with the stakeholder spectrum is we are looking to segment the ecosystem that your client's business or organization is a part of motivationally, right? That's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. So rather than segmenting things demographically and psychographically, we're doing it motivationally. And the spectrums allow us to do that. Now, a spectrum that I always use is the receptivity spectrum, right? That's something that I almost always use. But the remaining two spectrums can really be anything. These are just examples, but I'm trying to think of some others that I have used. So for example, if your client is running a brick and mortar business, right? Proximity might be something that is useful here as a spectrum, right? And the spectrums work like this, right? On one end of the spectrum, right, you've got the most whatever, right? So if we're talking about receptivity, the most receptive, okay? On the other side of the spectrum, we have the least receptive, right? And a note here about least receptive, this doesn't mean that they're not receptive at all, right? This means that they have as little receptivity as is possible without losing that receptivity, right? Because it's not necessarily, we may not necessarily be interested in working with or considering a stakeholder, someone who is not at all receptive to how we do things, right? So there's least receptive, and then midway through, there's midway receptivity, right? And what you want to do with the spectrum is ask yourselves, okay, who in this ecosystem is the most receptive to the ways in which we do things and the ways in which we approach things, right? Who's the most receptive? And why might that be the case? Remember, again, the focus here is motivation. What set of motivations makes something or someone receptive, and not just receptive, but the most receptive to our approach, to our brand, to what we're doing, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum, you ask the same question in reverse. What would motivate something or someone to be the least receptive, right? What set of motivations would contribute to a position of least receptive? And then finally, mid-receptive. So that's where my alternative starts, right? The reason that this alternative is useful or important is because rather than saying, oh, I'm going to choose this kind of stakeholder, or I'm going to choose this, 35-year-old woman who likes Hulu or whatever it happens to be, right? This makes it so any visibility biases that you have are not forcing you to overlook a specific kind of stakeholder, right? Let me give an example. I did hear this story once about a brick and mortar business in essentially what was a Brooklyn analog, right? And they had set up their business to completely and perfectly match their ideal client avatar, right? This person was tech savvy, they were a millennial, they were all the things, right? And one of the things that they put in place in this brick and mortar store, and this was a number of years ago, right, was sort of like an Apple Pay situation, right? Like you could pay with your phone, and that's all that they allowed in the store, right? Now, this is something that their ideal client avatar loved, perfection for them, right? This was less loved by the people who actually lived in the community that they'd settled themselves in. And that's because the folks who were living in that community, they couldn't participate. Their phones didn't have the tech to allow them to participate, right? Remember, this was a number of years ago before, paying with your phone became ubiquitous. That stakeholder was overlooked. But if you're doing something like a receptivity spectrum, they won't be, because you're asking yourself the question, who is the least receptive to how we're doing things, why we're doing things, etc., right? And that allows you to say, oh, well, you know what? Someone might be not receptive to this system that we have here because like they can't actually participate in this. Oh, why might they not be able to participate in this? And then that allows you to investigate further, right? Motivation. This is key. All right. So that's the first part of my alternative to ideal client avatars. It's the stakeholder spectrum. The second part is then to take, how do I put this? Essentially what happens is this, right? That when you do enough of these stakeholder spectrums, and I found that 3 tends to be the sweet spot, right? You'll start seeing patterns, right? You'll start noticing like, oh, the person or the stakeholder who's most receptive is also like somewhere else on a different spectrum, right? And you begin to consolidate those stakeholders. You start to see those patterns. And once you consolidate the various stakeholders that are required for the success of this brand, right? The motivational profiles, essentially. The second step is to create what I call a relationship portfolio of those stakeholders. Now, in the work that I've done and the research that I've done, I found that there tends to be a minimum of 4 or so stakeholders that are actually required for the success of any brand, right? And so generally, once you consolidate the various spectrums, you come away with a minimum of 4 discrete, separate motivational profiles or motivational groups, right? The relationship portfolio then allows you to look more closely into each of those stakeholder types, right? Or into each of those motivational segments, let's say, right? And these are the metrics essentially, or the things, the data that I collate specifically in my relationship portfolios. They have names and things that I figured I would just tell you what they are instead of giving you a special branded name for them, right? So the first of these is what facet of your client's work, their brand, their product, etc., will matter most to this particular stakeholder, right? Understanding that that sort of thing is going to shift as time and context does, right? So that's the first thing. What matters most to them, and what matters most to them, what will matter most to them next, right? So having a framework for understanding how that shifts. That's sort of the foundation of the relationship portfolio. The next piece here is sort of, okay, at what point do they stop rolling their eyes? Right. And so what I mean by this, right, is like there's a threshold, right? That you will share, talk about either the brand or the company or whatever it happens to be, the product, the service, right? And folks are rolling their eyes or here we go. Ooh, right? At what point do we get over that threshold of been here, done that? And do we get to that point of, oh, that's interesting? Specifically, I call this the eye roll threshold, but it's essentially how you stay ahead of market saturation, right? Like that's really what we're doing here. The next thing is understanding the 3 most important resources to that particular stakeholder and how much of each of those resources they feel like they have, okay? And and that allows you to essentially meet them where they're at. This is a really key motivational driver, right? Next, what kinds of investments are they making with these resources and why are they making those investments, right? And folks might see that and be like, well, isn't this kind of psychographic, right? Isn't this kind of like Hulu versus Netflix or what have you? And I'd say like, maybe if you're like squinting at it, I'm not going to poo-poo psychographics necessarily, right? But what I will say is that you want the right psychographics, right? You want the psychographics that are connected to what will motivate somebody, right? What affects or what shifts the motivations that someone might have. And that's one of them. The next and the final 2 are not always necessary. They're not always present in a relationship portfolio, but depending on the kind of client that you're working with or organization that you're working with, they might be necessary. And it's one, how much change do we need to make happen in order to meet our goals as an organization, right? So how much change does this stakeholder need to actually make happen or have happen in their lives in order for us to have met our goals? How far do they need to go, essentially? And then finally, how ready is this stakeholder to change? So these are all the pieces that go into what I call a relationship portfolio. And when I'm working with clients, they'll have 4 or 5 of these, right? I've never worked with a client that wasn't like the United Nations that had more than 10 stakeholders, right? Usually you're looking at something that's around like 5 or so, right? And understanding that the answers to each of these things, each of these metrics in the relationship portfolio is going to look different depending on the motivational profile or the motivational segment that we're talking about. So, questions?
Feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A section.
While
I
we're
know-
waiting, Chloe, how long does this process typically take you when you're working with a client? Just out of curiosity, like the general
Yeah.
weeks, days, months.
Yeah. So honestly, it does depend, right? It depends on the size of the business that I'm working with or the size of the organization that I'm working with. I would say anywhere from 2 weeks to a month for the entire process. And this is going from a business that is, it's a soloist shop, right? In which case we're looking at something that's closer to a couple of weeks, maybe less, depending also on their schedule, right? Like, because they have their own situation. And a larger organization, right? Something that might have like less than 500 employees, and the team that I'm working with is like a team of 10 or something like that, right? And that might be closer to a month, right? It doesn't often take much longer than this when I'm doing it, unless we have a lot of stakeholders. And like I said, usually that's a situation where it's a I mean, the UN is probably the best example that I can give from personal experience, where there's just so many stakeholders that you need to keep tabs on. So, and that would take much longer than a month.
And how in that process, how much of that is workshop versus research, like on your own versus like collaborative sharing?
So, again, this depends. And that's because I have a few different orientations to my offerings, right? So depending on who I'm working with, we might be doing this work asynchronously, in which case I could get away with 2 hours worth of workshopping and the rest happening asynchronously to get this done. So like on the low end. And then in terms of like workshopping versus work that they're doing or I am doing on my own, on the outer end, I might say something closer to, I might say something closer to a week.
Got it.
Yeah, like a week of, 3 to 5 days of workshopping, right? And maybe a couple of weeks of my own work or them doing their own work, sort of like on the outside. And again, this is huge. Like we're talking like there's a lot of stakeholders involved in the process when we're doing something like that.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. Well, we do have a few questions. Alicia, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Read it off and then we'll kind of volley back and forth.
Got it. So once you've got the relationship portfolios, are you leveraging those to guide creative, or are there additional steps and considerations? How do we operationalize these?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes and yes. So yes, we are absolutely using these to inform creative. Yes. There are and can be additional steps. Goodness gracious. And now I'm like, okay, my whole methodology I share now. Cool, got it. And so so this is not something that you necessarily need to do in order to operationalize these. But I do have a process of let's just think of branding from like the visual component and then like the communications component, let's say, right? Just to narrow things down. So you can, and I do absolutely take the relationship portfolios and allow that to help us triangulate appropriate visual language, right? Um, and the sort of rubric that I use for this, or the guide that I use for this, is we want the visual language to be industry aware, right? So you want to look like you belong to the industry, and you want to be using the codes and the schemas of the industry, right? But you want to be distinct. And how distinct is going to depend on, again, the brand, the company, or what have you that we're dealing with, right? But you want to remember that the idea is to get past the brain's filters and to be memorable so that the brand can be influential in the first place, right? The assets that we're talking about need to be memorable, right? And so the relationship portfolios and the stakeholder spectrums give us enough information to understand what might be memorable, because we understand to a certain extent what will motivate them, right? So yes, absolutely do use this, but there can be some intermediary steps if you're trying to then translate that into visual language, for example. For something that has to do with like communications, written language, that sort of thing, yep, there can be a few more steps, but you can just use the portfolio and run with it. The additional steps that I tend to do are to say, okay, these are the various phases of our relationship with this particular stakeholder. So how does this motivational profile express itself across those different phases of relationship, right? That's the extra step that I might take, for example. Hopefully that is helpful. And
Very helpful.
feel free to ask further questions
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that if it's too abstract. Yeah.
No. I think that was great. We do have a couple of other questions. Do you rely solely on the client to answer these questions and build these relationship portfolios, or do you recommend qualitative and quantitative research? And as an add-on, any advice on that research activities for this framework, that would be delightful.
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes and yes again.
Great.
So, frankly, it depends on what phase of development the client happens to be at, right? If they are in a place where they do tend to understand the motivations of the various stakeholders already, then yeah, I will largely rely on the client, and I might do a little bit of investigating on my own. But the percentage, like the breakdown of that might be something like 90% I'm relying on the client, and like 10% it's me doing like a due diligence check, right? However, if they are in a place in their development where they have no idea, right? And there are lots of reasons that this might be the case. They might just be starting out. They might be shifting into a new sort of ecosystem. They might be pivoting, whatever it happens to be, right? If they have no idea, then yes, absolutely, I do go ahead and do a sort of quantitative, qualitative study. And gosh, where do I even start with this? In terms of the kind of information that we're looking for, this is especially where those last two questions in the relationship portfolio become really useful, or the last two sort of metrics. How ready are they for change, and how much change do we need to make happen, right? And so what you want to do is you want to shape questions essentially around that. That's sort of where you start. I'm sure some of us are familiar with the jobs to be done framework, right? There are lots of different schools of thought as far as jobs to be done is concerned, right? I happen to fall probably closer to the Alan Clement side of the argument, maybe I'll say. And so that's the like when kale competes with coffee type thing, if you want a resource on that. And I bring that up, or essentially I say that because when you're doing a qualitative and a quantitative look into these motivational segments, the kind of thing that you might be looking at, sorry, I'm also just checking time to make sure I'm not taking too long with these questions. The kind of things that you will be looking for are, like choice set, right? Like what are the options that this particular stakeholder has currently right now that they can use to meet this motivation that they are expressing, right? Understanding that their choice set also often does include doing nothing, often does include combining weird things and retrofitting things, right? So like understanding choice set, right? Understanding what would catalyze them to shift, right? That's another set of information that you're looking for, right? So there are, long story short, read When Kale and Coffee Compete.
Good advice.
Yes, read When Kale and Coffee Compete, because he does get into some of those metrics that you might want to look into as far as understanding and pulling out motivational information. So I'll instead of like trying to summarize the book to you in T-2, I will just say start there and then follow the rabbit hole that it opens up for you. Hopefully that is helpful.
I'm sure it will. Yeah, that's great. Well, we still have a little bit of time and 2 more questions left. So go ahead, Alicia.
Yeah, I think this is probably a bit of a follow-up on that last one, which is, how do you create these groupings without making assumptions? Is it focus groups or other surveys?
Yeah. And so again, this is going to depend on the kind of client that you are working with. Yes, focus groups and surveys can help. But you also want to be aware of the fact that there's what people say and what they do, right? And what people say and what they do don't always match. And so you want to be leery of how much you invest in or take stock in what people say, right? So that, yes, obviously surveys and focus groups are helpful information, right? Ethnographic studies and so on and so forth, like all of that is really useful. And also be paying attention to behavior. So that's one half of the answer that I would say. Could you repeat the question? Because there was the first half that I wanted
Yeah.
to respond to.
How do you create these groupings without making assumptions?
Yeah, that's what it was. And so what I would say is this is really the role of the stakeholder spectrum, right? That if you are picking your spectrums well, and like that's a whole other talk about how to go and pick the correct spectrums, right? Like that's literally a whole other hour. But if you're picking your spectrums well, then at the very least, the kinds of assumptions that you will be making are less problematic, right? And I also I want to be careful here in saying that we are human beings. And so we have cognitive biases that's largely how we operate, right? So some of these biases are going to be there and are going to be baked into how we behave no matter what. What we want to do is make sure that we are minimizing how poisonous those biases can be, right? And so not all assumptions are bad. We just want to make sure that the kinds of assumptions that we are making aren't predicated on our basest and worst impulses. So that's the answer that I would give to that. That like you're still going to be making assumptions, some assumptions, right? You just want to position yourself and equip yourself to be making better assumptions, more informed assumptions, and less problematic and less poisonous assumptions.
Great. Thank you very much. One more quick question before our time is up. How often do you revisit your audience and go through this process? Like as a brand evolves over time, I have to imagine there's got to be a lot of opportunities to kind of continuously improve, as we say in the B Corp community often.
I love this question. I love this question. It's so good. Congratulations to whoever asked this question because it's officially my favorite question. So yes, you're going to revisit this. How often? Honestly, I would say every time there seems to have been a massive shift in the environment of some kind, right? That's certainly a time when you're going to absolutely need to revisit the stakeholder spectrums and the relationship portfolios and these motivational segments, right? So anytime like that is like an immediate, like, yes, we're going to go do this. I would also say I think anytime we have like a major decision that a company is making, right? Something that could either make or break the company, something that could, something to the tunes of millions of dollars, right? Or like something that proportionally is a huge deal to this company. And this might be money, and this might be time, this might be some other resource, right? But like anytime something like that comes up, I always sort of stop and say, okay, when was the last time we looked at the relationship portfolios, right? When was the last time we assessed these things? And if it's recent, right? If it's within the last 6 months, if it's within the last year, and like we haven't had like a pandemic or something, right? Then like, yeah, it feels like this is probably still going to be a good bet to go with, right? But if it has been some time, right? Then that's the moment that I would say, okay, maybe let's go back and like look at some of this and see if this still is the case, or if we need to shift, for example, what matters most, right? Like that first metric that I spoke about, right? What matters most, again, it's context specific, and you want to have a framework that allows you to understand that in a context agnostic sort of way. So that might just be as simple as going into the relationship portfolio and saying, hey, we're in a different context, so let's shift to what we understand to matter most to this person in that context, right? So it might not be a big overhaul so much as like going in and being like, okay, so we're going to put this sticker on right now. So yeah, that's what I would suggest. When big things happen, and when it's been like a number of
Wow.
years, yeah, like a number of
Yeah.
years, right? So that's what I'd say.
That's great. Well, Chloe, this was fantastic. This was really, really great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for answering all of our questions. Really incredible. I look forward to learning more from you and staying in touch with you. And you're always welcome to come back and join us anytime for sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is such a delight.
Yeah, thanks. Alicia, anything else you want to add before we close out our session here?
Just that I dropped her LinkedIn in the chat. I'll drop it again so you can follow her and stay connected. And then, as we also, I think maybe noted in the chat, we'll be posting this recording on the B-Lab YouTube channel also. So if you want to come back and reference it later or share it with other team members who maybe couldn't show up live today, we'll let you all know, and that becomes available.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on the Beehive and interacting with you and collaborating with you soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was delightful. I'm so glad. I'm